You are listening to a story exclusively narrated on the Mafia Boss Love Story channel. Relax and step into the world of love stories filled with mystery, emotions, and passion. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment to support us. This content is the property of Mafia Boss Love Story. Please do not copy or re-upload it in any form. The bar smelled like bourbon and rain, the way it always did in New Orleans after midnight, when the tourists had staggered back to their hotels and only the real drinkers remained. Sophie Bennett wiped down the mahogany counter with the same cloth she'd used for 3 years, moving in slow, practiced circles, and told herself, as she told herself every night, that this was her life now, not the other one. Not the one buried 20 years deep under a name that wasn't hers. "Another round, sugar?" she asked the man at the end of the bar, and he grunted something that might have been yes, might have been nothing at all. She poured anyway. In this job, you learned to read silence better than words. The quarter note wasn't much to look at. A narrow shotgun building on a side street off Frenchman, string lights sagging over the bar, a jukebox that only worked if you hit it in the right place. But it was hers. Or rather, it was Sophie Bennett's. And Sophie Bennett was the only person Elena Marchetti had ever been allowed to become. She'd learned the accent first. Then the walk, looser, less careful than the one her mother had taught her, a duchess's posture drilled into a 5-year-old who used to twirl in ballrooms before the blood started. She'd learned to laugh too loud at bad jokes, to let her hair go wild in humidity instead of pinning it back, to forget, or pretend to forget, that her real name had once meant something to men who killed for a living. Elena Marchetti had died the night her father did. That was the story, anyway. The only story that mattered, the one that kept her breathing. She was drying a rocks glass when the bell over the door jingled and Marcus Rossi walked in like he owned the place, which, in a sense, he did. Not the building, but the neighbourhood, the blocks, the small mercies that kept a woman like her unbothered by men who might ask too many questions. He came in maybe twice a month, always alone, always polite in that quiet, watchful way of his, and he always sat at the far corner of the bar where the light didn't reach. "Evening, Sophie." His voice was low, and there was something in the way he said her name, her fake name, that told her he knew exactly how false it tasted in his mouth. "Marcus?" She set a tumbler in front of him without being asked. "Jameson, neat." He never varied. "You're out late." "Insomnia." He turned the glass slowly, not drinking. "Or maybe I just like this place." "Or maybe you like checking on me," she said, quieter, leaning across the bar so the two drunks at the pool table wouldn't hear. "Which you don't have to do, you know. I've kept myself alive for 20 years without a Rossi looking over my shoulder." Something flickered across his face. Guilt, maybe, or something closer to longing that he buried fast, the way he always did. Marcus Rossi was the only living person who knew the truth of her, the only one who'd recognized the ghost of her mother's cheekbones in her face the first time he'd walked into this bar 3 years ago and nearly dropped his drink. He could have sold that information to his brother for a fortune in leverage. He hadn't. He'd kept her secret buried instead, the way he buried so many other things, his own feelings included. "There's movement," he said instead, voice dropping further. "On the Delacroix docks. Falcone's been sniffing around, asking questions about old debts, old names." Sophie's hand stilled on the glass she was polishing. What kind of names? Marchetti names. He watched her carefully, the way he always did when the subject came too close to the bone. I don't think anyone's connected you to it. Not yet. But Gabriel's been strange lately, restless. He wants blood for what happened to our father, and he's been digging in places he shouldn't. Your father was murdered by my father's men, Sophie said flatly, because there was no use pretending otherwise between the two of them. Not anymore. I understand why your brother wants a reckoning. I just need him to never learn where to find it. He won't. Marcus finally drank, the whiskey disappearing in one long swallow. I won't let him. She wanted to believe that. She wanted to believe a lot of things Marcus Rossi told her in the low hours of the night, wrapped in cigarette smoke and unspoken guilt. But belief was a currency Sophie Bennett, Elena Marchetti, had learned not to spend freely. Not after everything. Not after watching her mother's hands shake as she cut off 12 inches of dark hair in a motel bathroom outside Baton Rouge, dyeing it blonde with a box kit, whispering, "You are Sophie now. You were never anyone else. Do you understand me?" while sirens wailed somewhere in the distance. She had been 5 years old. She remembered the smell of the dye more than she remembered her father's face. I should close up, she said, because the ache of memory was rising in her throat and she didn't trust her voice to hold much longer. Marcus nodded, set a 20 on the bar that was twice what the drink cost, and rose. At the door, he paused, looking back at her with an expression she'd spent 3 years pretending not to notice. Something raw, something that had no business existing between a Rossi and a Marchetti, however buried the second name was. "Be careful, Sophie," he said. "Please." She didn't know, as she locked the door behind him and killed the lights, that she had exactly 6 days left before the careful, invisible life she'd built would collapse into the very world she'd been hidden from. The men came for her on a Tuesday, which felt, in the strange arithmetic of trauma, like the wrong day for the world to end. Tuesdays were slow at the bar. She'd been walking to her car in the gravel lot behind the building, keys already laced through her fingers, the way every woman who'd ever walked alone at night learned to hold them, when the van doors slid open and 2 shapes moved faster than she could scream. A hand closed over her mouth, cloth, chemical sweet, pressed to her nose. The world tilted sideways and went soft at the edges, and the last thing she registered was the gravel biting into her knees as she went down, and a voice, clipped, professional, utterly without malice, which somehow frightened her more than malice would have, saying, "Got her. Move." She woke in darkness that smelled of leather and gun oil, her wrists bound in front of her with a zip tie that cut thin lines into her skin when she tested it. The floor beneath her rocked gently. A boat, she realized, or a large vehicle idling on water-adjacent ground. Her head throbbed. Her mouth tasted of chemicals and old fear. Marchetti or Bennett, she thought, forcing herself to breathe slow through her nose, the way she'd trained herself for 2 decades in case this exact moment ever arrived. Which one did they come for? The door, heavy, metal, the kind that belonged in a shipping container more than a room, groaned open, and light spilled in, and a man walked through it who Sophie recognized instantly, even though she'd never once seen him in person. Gabriel Rossi. She'd heard his name whispered in half the conversations Marcus ever let slip. She'd seen his photograph once, blurred and grainy, in an old newspaper clipping her mother had kept in a shoebox of things she was never supposed to find. But no photograph had prepared her for the reality of him. The height of him filling the doorway, the dark, tailored suit that looked wrong on a man clearly built for violence rather than boardrooms, the black hair swept back from a face that might have been beautiful if it hadn't been so utterly, chillingly still. His eyes found her in the dim light and did not soften, did not widen, did not do anything a human face was supposed to do upon finding a frightened woman zip-tied to a chair. "Sophie Bennett," he said, and his voice was low, unhurried, the voice of a man who had never once in his life needed to raise it to be obeyed. "Bartender, no family on record, no next of kin, which is strange for a woman who apparently means enough to certain people that they've been asking after her whereabouts for weeks. I don't know what you're talking about." Her voice came out steadier than she expected, years of practiced composure rising up to meet the moment, even through the fog of the drug. "You have the wrong person." "Do I?" He crouched, unhurried, until they were eye level, and she caught, up close, the faint white scar that cut through one dark eyebrow, the kind of mark a knife left, not an accident. "Vincent Falcone's men have been circling your bar for a month. My brother's been visiting you twice monthly for 3 years, which is unusual because Marcus doesn't do sentiment. And now here you are. No family, no history before the age of 5, according to the records my people pulled. A ghost wearing a woman's face." He tilted his head. "Ghosts are useful, Miss Bennett. Ghosts are exactly what men in my line of work need when they want leverage against an enemy who thinks he's hidden his pieces well." Fear, cold and clean, cut through the last of the chemical haze. "He doesn't know what I am," she realized. "He thinks I'm someone else's pawn. He has no idea I'm the queen." "I'm nobody's leverage," she said. "I pour drinks for tourists. That's all I am." Gabriel's mouth curved, not quite a smile, something colder, something that made the small hairs on her arms rise. Everyone says that, right up until they realize how useful their fear makes them. He rose, straightened his cuffs with the unbothered precision of a man discussing dinner reservations rather than kidnapping. "You'll stay here. My men will bring you food, water, whatever you need. You will not be harmed, unless you attempt to run, in which case I promise you the alternative will be considerably less comfortable than this room." "Who do you think I belong to?" The question slipped out before she could stop it, dangerous and probing, but she needed to know how close the danger sat to the bone. For a moment, something almost human moved behind Gabriel Rossi's eyes, calculation maybe, or the faint pleasure of a man who enjoyed being asked things he intended not to answer. "That," he said, "is a conversation for another day. Rest, Miss Bennett. You'll need it." He left. The door groaned shut, the bolt slid home, and Sophie sat alone in the dark, with her wrists bleeding thin lines around plastic, thinking of her mother's shaking hands in that motel bathroom 20 years ago. Thinking, he doesn't know. He doesn't know. As long as he doesn't know, I might survive this. But somewhere beneath the fear, in a place she didn't want to look at too closely, another thought moved, quieter, more dangerous than any of the ones about survival. The way his eyes had held hers without a flicker of pity, without a shred of performance. She had spent 3 years watching Marcus Rossi's careful, guilty tenderness and had never once felt what she felt in 90 seconds of Gabriel Rossi's total, merciless attention. God help me, she thought, and didn't finish the sentence because she didn't yet have words for where it was going to lead. Days blurred in captivity, the way Sophie imagined they must in prisons, in convents, in any place where time was measured by meals instead of clocks. The room they moved her to on the second day was nicer than the first. A real bed, a bathroom with actual plumbing, a window painted over with black so she couldn't see out, though the muffled cry of gulls told her she was still somewhere near the water. Someone brought her clothes that fit, toiletries that weren't cheap, food that was, if she was honest, better than anything she cooked for herself at home. Captivity, Rossi style, apparently came with room service. It was Marcus who came on the third day, and the sight of him standing in the doorway with a tray of food and an expression of pure, silent devastation nearly broke the careful composure she'd been holding since the van doors opened. Marcus. She was on her feet before she'd decided to move. Please tell me you didn't know about this. I didn't know until it was already done. His voice was rough, and he set the tray down like his hands might not manage the job much longer if he didn't. Gabriel doesn't run everything through me. He's been building something for weeks. I knew he suspected someone close to Falcone. I didn't know he'd land on you. He looked at her, agony plain on his face. Sophie, I am so sorry. Does he know? She kept her voice to barely a whisper, though she doubted the room was clean of listening devices. Does he know what I am? No, Marcus shook his head hard. He thinks you're connected to Falcone somehow, a mistress, an informant, something in that world. He has no idea you're... He stopped himself, glancing at the door, and lowered his voice further. He has no idea whose blood is actually in your veins. And it has to stay that way, Sophie. If he finds out you're Marchetti's daughter, if he finds out you're the reason our father is in the ground, he'll kill me. She said it plainly, because there was no version of the sentence that softened the truth. I know, Marcus. I've known since I was 5 years old that this was always a possibility. I just didn't think it would happen in my 30s, tied to a chair in a Rossi safe house. Marcus's jaw worked, and for a moment the mask he wore so carefully around his brother slipped entirely, and she saw the rawness underneath. 3 years of watching her pour drinks in a bar that smelled like bourbon and rain. 3 years of loving a woman he could never claim, never protect openly, never even acknowledge the way he wanted to. I'll get you out, he said. I swear to God, Sophie, I'll find a way. And what happens to you if Gabriel finds out you helped his enemy's daughter escape? She reached out, despite the restraint still loose around one wrist, touched his forearm gently. You'd lose everything. Your family. Maybe your life. I don't care. I do. She held his gaze, steady, because whatever complicated tenderness lived between them, it had never once tipped into the kind of love that burned reckless. It was gratitude, loyalty, the strange intimacy of shared secrets, not the all-consuming thing poets wrote about, and they both, on some level, had always known it. You've protected me for 3 years without asking for anything back. I'm not going to let you throw your life away trying to be my hero now. The door groaned open before Marcus could answer, and Gabriel Rossi filled the frame, dark eyes moving from his brother's stricken face to Sophie's hand still resting on his arm. And something shifted behind that unreadable expression, something cold and assessing, filing away a piece of information he hadn't had a moment ago. "Marcus," Gabriel said, voice deceptively mild. "A word." Marcus's hand found Sophie's for half a second, a brief, desperate pressure of fingers, before he followed his brother out, and the door shut, and Sophie was alone again, with the sound of her own heartbeat and the growing, terrible awareness that she had just handed Gabriel Rossi a question he would not stop asking until he found the answer. Why does my brother look at this woman like she's something to protect? She didn't hear the conversation that followed in the hallway, but she could imagine its shape well enough from the low murmur of voices, the sharp edge that crept into Gabriel's tone near the end. When he returned alone 20 minutes later, he came without the tray, without pretense, and sat in the single chair across from her bed with the unhurried patience of a predator who had all the time in the world. "My brother seems fond of you," he said. "Your brother is a regular at my bar. Regulars get familiar. Regulars don't hold your hand like they're afraid you'll disappear." Gabriel's eyes never left her face, cataloguing, she realized, every micro-flinch, every held breath. "Tell me something true, Miss Bennet. Just one thing. I find I have very little patience left for lies." Sophie held his gaze and reached carefully for the truest lie she had. "I'm scared," she said. "That's true. I'm sitting in a room I can't leave, talking to a man who kidnapped me off the street, and I have no idea what you want from me, or what happens if I can't give it to you. That's the truest thing I have." Something in his expression eased, fractionally, the way ice might ease a half-degree without ever approaching thaw. "That," he said, rising, "is a start." He left without another word, and Sophie sat in the dim room replaying the conversation, replaying the particular way his eyes had lingered on her mouth when she spoke, and understood, with sick, dawning clarity, that surviving Gabriel Rossi was going to require more than silence. It was going to require becoming someone he wanted to keep. Gabriel Rossi had made his father a promise in a hospital corridor 20 years ago, kneeling on linoleum, still slick with blood that wasn't his, holding a hand that had gone slack before the paramedics even arrived. "I will find every Marchetti who did this, and I will make them understand what it cost." He had been 14 years old. He had meant it the way only a child could mean something. Absolutely, permanently, without the qualifications adulthood usually carved into a person's convictions. 20 years later, the vow hadn't softened. If anything, it had calcified into the architecture of who he was, the docks he controlled, the empire he'd built, brick by bloody brick, from his father's ashes, all of it in service to a promise made to a dying man's hand. Salvatore Marchetti had been killed in the counterstrike 18 months after that hospital corridor, shot 4 times outside a restaurant on Magazine Street. And Gabriel remembered feeling, when the news reached him, not triumph, but a strange, hollow disappointment, as if half his purpose had died with the man he'd sworn to punish. But there had been a rumour, always, at the edges of the Marchetti collapse. A daughter, hidden, spirited away before the retaliation could reach her, a loose thread the old man's crumbling organisation had never managed to account for. Gabriel had chased that rumour for years, with the patient, obsessive focus of a man who did not know how to let a debt go unpaid. Every lead had gone cold, every informant had come up empty, until Falcone, desperate, cornered, trying to buy his way out of a debt he owed the Rossi organisation, had let slip, almost as an aside, that there was a woman in the quarter who kept turning up in conversations she had no business being part of. Sophie Bennett. A bartender with no family, no history before the age of 5, and a Rossi brother who visited her with suspicious regularity. It had seemed at first like exactly the kind of thin, promising thread Gabriel had spent years learning to pull. He hadn't expected her to be beautiful in the specific, unshowy way that made a man forget, for whole seconds at a time, what he'd taken her for. He hadn't expected the steadiness in her voice when she should have been sobbing and begging. He hadn't expected, standing in that dim room watching her hold his gaze without flinching, to feel something shift in his chest that had no business shifting at all. "You're distracted," his lieutenant Dante observed later that night, when Gabriel had summoned him to the study of the penthouse that overlooked the river, all glass and dark wood, and the low gleam of a city that both feared and depended on the man who owned it. The Bennett woman. "You've had her 3 days and made no move to use her." "I'm establishing what she knows." Gabriel didn't look up from the ledger he wasn't really reading. "Falcone's people were circling her for a reason. I want to understand that reason before I decide what she's worth." "Or," Dante said, with the particular boldness of a man who'd known Gabriel since they were boys running errands on these same docks, "you're stalling because some part of you doesn't want the answer to be simple." Gabriel's jaw tightened. "Careful. I've watched you burn men alive for touching what's yours, Gabriel. I've never once watched you hesitate." Dante shrugged, unbothered by the warning in his boss's tone. 3 days is a long time to hesitate over a bartender. Gabriel said nothing, because there was nothing true he could say that wouldn't sound like exactly the weakness Dante was describing. He thought of her voice. "I'm scared, that's true." And the strange, unfamiliar ache that admission had produced, somewhere beneath his ribs. An ache that had nothing to do with revenge, and everything to do with the particular vulnerability of a woman choosing honesty over easy lies. He had killed men for less provocation than the way she'd looked at him. "I want everything on her," he said finally. "Birth records, school records, anything before the age of 5, no matter how deep you have to dig. If there's a real name under Sophie Bennett, I want it on my desk within the week." Dante nodded and rose, but paused at the door. "And if the real name leads somewhere you don't expect?" Gabriel's eyes lifted, dark and unreadable in the low light. "Then I suppose I'll finally get the answer I've spent 20 years looking for." He didn't know, saying it, how close that answer already sat, 3 floors below him, in a room with a painted-over window, wearing a stranger's face and carrying, in her blood, the exact debt he had sworn his whole life to collect. Marcus Rossi had loved exactly one woman in his adult life, and he had loved her in complete, agonizing silence for 3 years, because the alternative, telling her, telling anyone, would have gotten her killed the moment the words left his mouth. He remembered the night he'd recognized her. She'd been pouring his whiskey with her hair falling loose across her face, laughing at something a regular had said, and something about the tilt of her jaw, the particular grey-green of her eyes, had snagged in his memory like a hook catching cloth. His mother had kept photographs, Old ones, from the years before the wars, when Rossis and Marchettis had occasionally shared the same rooms at charity galas and civic functions before blood made that impossible. There had been a photograph of Salvatore Marchetti's wife holding a dark-haired toddler at some fundraiser, and the toddler's eyes had been that exact grey-green, and Marcus had gone home that night and dug through his mother's old boxes until he found it, holding the photograph next to his memory of the bartender's face until his hands shook with certainty. He hadn't told Gabriel. He hadn't told anyone. He'd gone back to that bar the following week, ostensibly for a drink, and had watched her closely enough to confirm what some instinctive, unwanted part of him already believed. And then he'd made a choice that had shaped the last 3 years of his life. He would protect her, quietly, completely, without ever explaining why, without ever telling her the full truth of how much he knew, without ever, God help him, admitting the other thing that had grown alongside the protectiveness, something that felt disturbingly like love, aimed at exactly the woman he was supposed to consider his family's mortal enemy. Now she was 3 floors below him in a Rossi safe house, and his brother was digging through birth records with the patient hunger of a man who had waited 20 years for this exact excavation. And Marcus understood, with the sick clarity of a man watching a car crash unfold in slow motion, that he had perhaps another week before the truth came apart in his hands. "You're quiet," Gabriel said, over dinner that neither of them was really eating, the penthouse dining room lit low and gold, the river beyond the window smeared with the reflected lights of the docks their family had bled to control. "You've been quiet since I brought the woman in." "I don't like it," Marcus said, which was true enough to be safe. "Kidnapping civilians. It's not how we usually operate. She's not a civilian." "Falcone's people have been circling her for weeks. There's a reason for that, and I intend to find it." Gabriel studied his brother with the particular attentiveness that made Marcus's skin crawl, the same forensic focus that had built an empire out of other men's mistakes. "You touched her hand today, in the safe house." Marcus kept his expression carefully neutral, years of practice holding the mask in place, even as his heart slammed against his ribs. "She's a friend. I've known her for years, from the bar. Seeing her tied to a chair isn't easy for me, no matter what she might be involved in." "A friend." Gabriel repeated the word slowly, turning it over like a man checking for hidden edges. "You've never once, in 30 years, described anyone as simply a friend, Marcus. You catalogue people by usefulness or threat. Which is she?" "Neither," Marcus said too fast, and saw the flicker of interest sharpen in his brother's eyes at the speed of the denial. "She's just someone I care about. That's allowed, isn't it, even in this family?" Gabriel was quiet for a long moment, dark eyes assessing in the candlelight, and Marcus braced for the question he was certain was coming. "How much do you care, and why, and what aren't you telling me?" But instead, his brother simply said, "Careful, little brother. Caring about the wrong person in our world has a way of getting people killed. I would hate for that person to be you." It was, Marcus understood later, lying awake in his own apartment with the city's noise bleeding through the windows, the closest thing to a warning his brother had ever given him. Not a threat, exactly, but an acknowledgement that Gabriel had noticed something worth watching. And Marcus knew, with the particular despair of a man caught between 2 loves that could never coexist, that he had, perhaps, days left to decide what mattered more: the brother who had raised him after their father's murder, or the woman whose survival depended on a secret Marcus alone had chosen, 3 years ago, to carry. He thought of Sophie's hand under his in that dim room, the brief, desperate pressure of her fingers, and understood that whatever choice he eventually made, it was going to cost him something he'd never get back. By the second week, Gabriel had stopped sending Dante to interrogate her and started coming himself, which Sophie understood with the particular clarity of a woman who'd spent her whole life reading danger in a room before she read anything else, was either a very good sign or a very bad one. Possibly both. He came in the evenings, usually with 2 glasses and a bottle of something expensive, and he would sit across from her in the chair that had become, without either of them naming it as such, his chair, and they would talk. Not about Falcone, not about the reasons she'd been taken, about nothing really. Books she'd read, cities he'd travelled to on business that was never quite explained, the particular ache of growing up too fast in a family that demanded more from a child than a child should ever be asked to give. "You said you don't have family," he said one night, swirling wine he hadn't yet tasted. "On record, I mean. No parents, no siblings. That's unusual for a woman your age." "My parents died when I was young," Sophie said, which was true in the way that mattered most, and false in every other way that could get her killed. "I was raised by people who weren't technically family. It's a long story. I have time." His dark eyes held hers, patient in a way that unsettled her more than any interrogation tactic could have, because patience from Gabriel Rossi felt like being studied by something that had already decided you were worth the wait. "Do you?" she asked instead of answering, deflecting the way she'd learned to deflect 2 decades ago. "Or do you just have more questions than you're willing to ask directly?" Something almost like amusement moved across his mouth, not quite a smile, but its cousin, close enough that she felt an unwelcome warmth bloom low in her chest at having produced it. "Perceptive," he said. "Most people who find themselves in your position spend their energy either begging or lying. You do neither. You redirect. It's a skill that takes years to develop, Miss Bennet. I find myself curious where you developed it." "Bartending," she said. "You learn to read a room fast or you get hurt." "Is that what this is? A room you're reading?" "Every room is a room I'm reading." She met his gaze steadily, daring him, in some reckless corner of herself, to keep pushing. "Including this one. Including you." He set the wineglass down, unfinished, and leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, close enough now that she could see the faint shadow of stubble along his jaw, the particular darkness of eyes that had clearly seen things no confession booth could absolve. "And what do you read in this room? In me?" The honest answer, a man who terrifies me, and a man I cannot stop thinking about in the same breath, which terrifies me more, sat too dangerously close to the surface to risk, so she reached for a version of the truth that was safer, though no less real. "A man who's been alone a long time," she said quietly, "longer than the years would suggest. A man who's carrying something so heavy he's forgotten what it feels like to put it down, even for an hour." Something shifted behind his eyes, not anger, which she'd half expected, but something rawer, more exposed, the flicker of a man who'd built an entire empire specifically so no one would ever get close enough to say something so accurate. "You should be careful," he said, voice lower now, rougher. "Reading a man that closely tends to end badly for the reader." "Are you threatening me?" I'm warning you." He rose, the distance between them collapsing to almost nothing for one suspended second, before he stepped back, putting the width of the room between them again, as if he'd caught himself reaching for something he had no business wanting. "There's a difference." He left without finishing his wine, and Sophie sat alone in the dim room with her pulse hammering in her throat, understanding with dawning, horrified clarity that the danger she needed to fear wasn't only the possibility that Gabriel Rossi would discover her true name, it was the possibility that some reckless, unguarded part of her had already stopped wanting to be rescued from this room at all. That night, lying on the bed that had slowly, without her permission, started to feel less like a cell, she thought of her mother's voice in that motel bathroom 20 years ago. "You are Sophie now. You were never anyone else." And understood, for the first time in 2 decades, how badly she wanted, just once, to be someone else's entirely. Not Eleanor Marchetti, dead and buried. Not Sophie Bennett, a careful fiction built to survive. Someone new. Someone Gabriel Rossi might actually want to keep, if he ever knew the whole truth of her, which he never could, which made the wanting itself a kind of slow, private tragedy she had no one to confess it to. She dreamed that night and many nights after of the restaurant on Magazine Street. She had been 11 years old when her father died, though by then she had already been Sophie Bennett for 6 years, tucked away in a modest house outside Baton Rouge with a woman she called Aunt Carol, who was, in reality, a Marchetti cousin twice removed, paid handsomely and sworn to secrecy by Sophie's mother before she, too, disappeared into whatever underground network kept the last of the Marchetti bloodline breathing. Sophie hadn't been at the restaurant. She had been half a state away, doing long division at a kitchen table, when the phone rang and Aunt Carol's face went the colour of old paper. She hadn't understood, then, that the man who died outside that restaurant was her father. She had understood only that Aunt Carol cried for 3 days and packed their bags on the 4th, moving them again, the way they moved every 18 months or so, always one step ahead of a danger Sophie had been taught to fear without ever being told its true shape. It was years later, 16, 17, old enough to start asking harder questions, before Aunt Carol finally told her the truth in fragments, late at night, half drunk on cheap wine and guilt. "Your father was Salvatore Marchetti. He ran the docks and half the ports from Miami to Houston before the Rossi family decided to take it from him, one body at a time. Your mother got you out 3 days after they killed your uncle, because she knew you'd be next once the retaliation started. She died 2 years later. An overdose, they said, though I never believed it. And I promised her, on the last night I ever saw her alive, that I would keep you as Sophie Bennett until the day I died. Because Elena Marchetti dying young was the only thing standing between you and the same grave your father ended up in." Sophie remembered asking, in the flat, disbelieving voice of a teenager confronting a truth too large for her chest, "Do they know I exist? The Rossis?" And Aunt Carol had shaken her head, certain in the way only fear could make a person certain. "No, and you will make sure for the rest of your life that they never do." She had kept that promise for 15 years. She had built Sophie Bennett brick by careful brick, The accent, the laugh, the loose blonde hair, the bar job that kept her invisible in plain sight, surrounded by strangers every night who never once looked past the surface she'd perfected. She had told herself over and over that Elena Marchetti was truly dead, that there was no version of her left to mourn or protect, only Sophie, only the fiction, only the woman who poured drinks and closed up alone and went home to an apartment with no photographs on the walls because photographs asked questions she couldn't answer. And now she lay in a Rossi's safe house, dreaming of a restaurant she'd never seen except in newspaper photographs, feeling something in her chest crack every time she thought of Gabriel Rossi's face, the scar through his eyebrow, the particular stillness of him, the way he'd looked at her like she was a puzzle worth solving rather than a pawn worth spending. She woke gasping some nights, certain she could smell gunpowder, certain she could hear her father's name being called by a stranger's voice across a restaurant patio 20 years gone. "He killed your father," she reminded herself, forcing the thought into shape, even as some traitorous part of her heart resisted it. His family put 4 bullets into Salvatore Marchetti and called it justice. Whatever this is, whatever's growing between the two of you in that dim room every night, it is built on the corpse of everything you came from. It cannot end anywhere but badly. But knowing a thing and feeling it were 2 entirely different countries, and Sophie had spent 20 years as a woman divided between them. The daughter she'd been born, and the woman she'd built to survive being her. Lying awake in the dark, listening to the muffled sound of gulls through a painted window, she understood, with a grief that had nowhere to go, that she was now dividing herself a 3rd way. The fugitive, the fiction, and whoever it was that Gabriel Rossi was slowly, dangerously coaxing out of the dark. He brought her a book on the 9th night, a worn paperback of poetry, spine cracked from use, the kind of thing a man like Gabriel Rossi had no business owning, let alone carrying into a captive's room like an offering. "You said you liked to read," he said, setting it on the small table by her bed without ceremony, as if the gesture cost him nothing, though the faint stiffness in his shoulders told a different story. "I don't have much fiction. This was my mother's." Sophie picked it up carefully, running her thumb along the cracked spine, the margins filled with faded pencil notes in handwriting too delicate to be his. "Was she a reader?" "She was, before my father died and grief took the taste for most things she used to love." Gabriel's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly, the only sign that the subject cost him something. "She kept this by her bed until the day she passed. I don't know why I brought it here. It seemed like something you'd want." "Thank you." She meant it more than the simple words could carry, and something in her voice must have betrayed that, because his eyes lingered on her face a beat too long before he looked away, toward the painted-over window, as if he could see through it by force of will alone. "You're not what I expected," he said abruptly, the words coming out rougher than his usual controlled cadence. "When Dante brought me your file, I expected someone frightened and pliable. Someone I could use and discard without much thought. Instead, I find myself—" He stopped, jaw working, clearly unhappy with wherever the sentence had been heading. "Instead, you find yourself what?" Sophie asked quietly, unable to stop herself from pressing, some reckless part of her wanting to hear him say it, even though every survival instinct she possessed screamed that this was exactly the kind of intimacy that would get her killed the moment he learned the truth. "Bringing a captive my dead mother's poetry," he said finally, with a self-deprecating twist to his mouth that looked almost foreign on features built for coldness. "Which is not something I do." which is not something I have ever done in 15 years of running an organization that requires me to treat people as instruments rather than—" He shook his head, cutting himself off again. "This is not what I intended, bringing you here." "What did you intend?" "Leverage. Information. A tool to use against Falcone, or whoever's actually pulling strings behind him." Gabriel's dark eyes found hers again, and this time he didn't look away. "Instead, I find myself sitting in this room most nights, telling you things about my mother I haven't said aloud to anyone in a decade, and I don't fully understand why, except that you look at me like you're not afraid of what I am, which no one has done in longer than I can remember." "I am afraid of what you are," Sophie said honestly, because it was true, and because the honesty felt in that moment like the only gift she had left to offer a man who'd just handed her his dead mother's most private possession. "I'm afraid of you every single day I've been in this room. But being afraid of someone and wanting to understand them aren't mutually exclusive, Gabriel. I learned that a long time ago." His name in her mouth seemed to land somewhere unexpected, because his expression shifted, softened at the edges in a way she hadn't yet seen, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the small room filled with nothing but the sound of their breathing and the distant muffled cry of gulls beyond the painted glass. "I should let you rest," he said finally, rising, though he paused at the door the way Marcus so often did, caught between leaving and staying, before he added, almost too quiet to hear, "Thank you for not lying to me. If only you knew," she thought, watching the door close behind him, "how much of what I've told you is the truest lie I have ever constructed." But even as the guilt rose, hot and unwelcome in her chest, she found herself opening his mother's book of poetry, reading by the low bedside lamp until her eyes grew heavy, feeling, for the first time since the van doors had slid open on that gravel lot, something dangerously close to safety. It would be, she thought later, one of the worst miscalculations of her life. The woman who arrived at the penthouse on the 12th day wore a red dress that cost more than most people made in a month, and moved through Gabriel's home like she'd walked its halls 100 times before. Which, Sophie learned later from an overheard conversation between guards, she had. Vivian Castellano, daughter of an old ally family, the kind of woman whose marriage to Gabriel Rossi had apparently been discussed at family dinners since they were both teenagers, a match built on business rather than anything so inconvenient as feeling. Sophie wasn't supposed to see her. She'd been allowed, by then, small freedoms, a supervised walk along the penthouse's private terrace, escorted trips to a kitchen far grander than any she'd cooked in before, and it was during one such walk, two guards trailing at a discreet distance, that she rounded a corner and found Gabriel standing close to Vivian Castellano in the wide marble foyer, the woman's manicured hand resting on his forearm with the easy familiarity of long acquaintance. "You've been distracted," Vivian was saying, voice pitched low and intimate. "Dante mentioned you have a guest. Some woman from the quarter?" "Business," Gabriel said, though something in his tone made Sophie's chest tighten unpleasantly. "Business doesn't usually keep you up at all hours, sitting with someone in a safe house, instead of delegating to Dante like you always do." Vivian's hand slid further up his arm, and Sophie watched with an ugly, unfamiliar twist of something that could only be jealousy. The way the other woman looked at Gabriel like he was already hers, already claimed, already understood, in ways Sophie, despite 2 weeks of stolen conversations and shared poetry, had no right to compete with. Our families have discussed a match for years, Gabriel. I'd hate for some passing distraction to complicate what's already been decided. Nothing has been decided, Gabriel said, and there was an edge in his voice now, cold enough that Sophie recognized, with some relief she immediately hated herself for feeling, the same controlled fury she'd seen directed at her during their first meeting. I've told your father the same thing I'll tell you. I have no interest in a marriage built on ledgers and territory. You say that now. Vivian's smile didn't waver, practiced and untroubled. But men like you always come around eventually. Duty has a way of winning. Sophie stepped back before either of them noticed her, heart hammering with an emotion she had no business feeling for a man who had kidnapped her, a man whose family had killed her father, a man she should have been plotting to escape rather than aching over in a marble hallway. But the jealousy sat in her chest like a stone, regardless of what logic demanded, hot and unwelcome, and she spent the rest of that evening turning the pages of his mother's poetry book without reading a single word, unable to stop replaying the easy, proprietary way Vivian Castellano's hand had rested on Gabriel's arm. He came to her room later than usual that night, jaw tight, shoulders carrying a tension she hadn't seen since the first day of her captivity, and poured himself a drink he didn't touch before speaking. You saw, he said, not a question. I saw a woman who clearly believes she has a claim on you, Sophie said, keeping her voice carefully neutral, even as something raw pushed at the edges of her control. I imagine she's not wrong to believe it. Business marriages make sense in your world. I understand that. Are you jealous, Miss Bennet? Something almost like satisfaction moved through his expression, dark and dangerous, the first genuine warmth she'd seen cross his face since the poetry book. I have no right to be jealous of anything you do, she said, which was true, and also, in the specific way that mattered, an admission she hadn't intended to make so plainly. I'm your captive, not your whatever she thinks she is to you. She's nothing to me. Gabriel set the untouched drink down and crossed the room in 3 unhurried strides, stopping close enough that she had to tilt her head back to hold his gaze, close enough that she could smell cedar and gun oil and something warmer underneath, something that made her pulse stutter dangerously. She's an arrangement my father made before he died, one I have refused for 15 years and will keep refusing, because I have never once, in my entire life, wanted a woman the way I found myself wanting the one currently sitting in a room I locked her into against her will, which should disturb me considerably more than it does. Gabriel, tell me to stop, he said, voice rough, close enough now that his breath ghosted warm against her jaw, and I will leave this room and never bring it up again. Tell me you don't feel what I feel every time I walk through that door, and I will believe you, and I will let this die exactly where it stands. Sophie's whole body screamed at her to say it. Stop, this cannot happen. You are the daughter of the man his family murdered. This can only end in blood. But when she opened her mouth, no denial came, only silence, only her own ragged breathing filling the space between them, and Gabriel Rossi, reading that silence with the same forensic precision he read everything else, closed the last inch of distance and kissed her like a man finally putting down something he'd carried too long. Marcus had come to the safe house that night to bring Sophie a burner phone, a small, foolish act of rebellion he'd been planning for days, a way to give her some sliver of control over her own fate, even if he couldn't yet find a way to get her out entirely. He hadn't expected to find Gabriel's car already in the drive, hadn't expected to walk in on the tail end of a conversation between guards in the kitchen who assumed, wrongly, that he already knew. "Boss has been up there almost an hour," one of them said, not bothering to lower his voice as Marcus passed. "Didn't figure Gabriel Rossi had it in him. The bartender must be something special." Marcus stood frozen in the hallway outside Sophie's door for a long moment, hand raised to knock, and did not knock, because some instinct, dread maybe, or the particular clarity that comes right before a heart breaks, told him what he would find if he opened it. He didn't open it. He stood in the dim hallway and listened to the low murmur of voices through the door, unable to make out words, but perfectly able to read the silences between them. And when the murmuring stopped entirely, replaced by nothing but breathing and the occasional soft, unmistakable sound of two people no longer talking at all, Marcus turned and walked away, with the burner phone still in his pocket and something inside his chest folding in on itself like paper catching fire. He drove for an hour with no destination, gripping the wheel until his knuckles went white, replaying 3 years of quiet devotion, every drink poured, every secret kept, every careful, painful distance he'd maintained because loving her openly would have gotten her killed. And understanding, with a grief that had nowhere honest to go, that his brother had just taken, in a single, unguarded hour, the thing Marcus had spent 3 years denying himself the right to want. This is what loyalty costs, he thought, pulling over on the shoulder of a dark stretch of highway outside the city, resting his forehead against the steering wheel. You protect the people you love by never letting them see how much you love them. And then you watch someone else walk through the door you were too careful to open. He should have felt only grief. He was surprised, turning the thought over and over in the dark, to find something else tangled in with it. Fear, sharp and immediate, because if Gabriel had fallen for Sophie the way the guard's gossip suggested, the danger to her had just multiplied rather than diminished. A man in love asked questions a man merely suspicious never bothered with. A man in love dug deeper, wanted more, refused to be satisfied with half-truths, the way Gabriel had been satisfied for 2 weeks with Sophie's careful deflections. He's going to find out, Marcus realized, sitting alone in his car with the city's distant glow smeared across the windshield. Not because he's looking for the truth about her family, because he loves her now, and love makes men relentless in ways suspicion never does. He's going to want to know everything about her, and eventually he's going to find something that doesn't add up, and when he does... He didn't finish the thought. He didn't need to. He'd known Gabriel his whole life, had watched him build an empire on the specific, unforgiving foundation of a vow made over their father's body. And Marcus understood with total, sickening certainty that whatever tenderness had grown in Gabriel towards Sophie Bennett would not survive contact with the knowledge that she was Salvatore Marchetti's daughter. Love, in his brother's world, had never once been strong enough to override blood debt. Gabriel would grieve, perhaps. He might even hesitate for a single unbearable moment. But in the end, the vow would win, because the vow had always won, because it was the only thing that had ever truly organized the chaos of losing their father too young. Marcus drove back to the city near dawn, exhausted and hollowed out, and made a decision that would define the rest of what happened. He would not tell Gabriel. He would not betray Sophie's secret. Not now, not ever. Whatever it cost him personally to watch his brother fall in love with a woman Marcus himself had loved in silence for 3 years. But he would also, he decided, start building something Gabriel didn't know about. An exit. A plan. A way to get Sophie out of New Orleans entirely if the truth ever threatened to surface. Because loving her, even from this distance, even having lost whatever claim he might once have imagined he had, meant making sure she survived whatever came next. He didn't sleep that night. He sat in his apartment with a burner phone he never delivered, staring at the city lights, and began, quietly, methodically, the work of trying to save a woman from his own brother's love. It was 3 days after the night that changed everything between them that Gabriel found the first thread that didn't fit. He hadn't meant to keep digging. Some part of him, the part that had spent 2 weeks falling for a woman he'd only intended to use, had wanted to let the investigation quietly die, satisfied enough with what he now believed about her involvement, or lack thereof, with Falcone's schemes. But Dante was thorough in the way Gabriel had trained him to be thorough, and the file that landed on his desk that morning contained a detail that snagged, immediately and uncomfortably, in the careful architecture of everything Gabriel had come to believe about Sophie Bennett. "Birth certificate's clean," Dante said, laying the papers out with the flat efficiency of a man delivering facts rather than opinions. "Louisiana. Born to a Carol Bennett, no father listed. Except," he tapped a second document, "Carol Bennett's social security number was issued in a batch pattern consistent with witness protection reissuance, and the school records, the ones from her early childhood, don't exist. Not lost, not sealed. They simply don't exist. Like the child didn't attend school before the age of 11, when a new set of records begins abruptly in Baton Rouge." Gabriel studied the papers in silence, the old cold focus of his profession settling back over him like armour he'd almost, dangerously, forgotten how to wear. "Someone built her a childhood," he said slowly. "From age 11 forward, at least. Which means whatever happened before that age was deliberately erased." "Witness protection doesn't erase school records," Dante said. "It relocates people and gives them new identities, but the paper trail usually holds together better than this. This looks like something else, something private. Someone with resources built this woman a past from scratch." Gabriel's mind moved through the possibilities with the same relentless precision that had built his empire. Informants who needed new lives, victims of trafficking rescued and rebuilt, or the possibility his gut kept circling back to with a dread he didn't want to examine too closely. Someone connected to organized crime whose family had needed her erased for her own survival. He thought of Marcus's hand on hers in that dim room. He thought of the particular, careful way Sophie deflected every question about her past, never quite lying, never quite answering, a skill Gabriel now understood with cold clarity could only have been trained into a child who'd needed to survive by exactly that kind of careful evasion. Pull everything on unresolved disappearances tied to Mafia collapses in this region, going back 25 years, Gabriel said. Children, specifically. daughters who vanished before retaliation could reach them. Dante's expression flickered, understanding dawning. You think she's connected to one of the old families? I think, Gabriel said, voice gone very quiet, very controlled, that someone spent considerable effort making sure a child born before 1999 simply stopped existing on paper. And I intend to know why before I let myself get any closer to the answer than I already have. He didn't sleep well that night, turning the puzzle over and over, and when he went to Sophie's room the following evening, he found himself watching her with new eyes, not the besotted attention of the past weeks, but the old forensic focus that had made him what he was, cataloguing the particular way she held herself, the faint accent that occasionally slipped when she was tired, the ease with which she'd once mentioned, in an unguarded moment, a detail about New Orleans docks from decades before she could possibly have witnessed them firsthand. "You're looking at me differently," Sophie said, setting down the book of poetry she'd been reading, some instinct in her clearly sensing the shift in the air between them. "Am I?" Gabriel kept his voice carefully mild, though something cold had settled permanently in his chest since Dante's file that morning. "Tell me about your mother, Sophie. Not the story you've given me twice already, about a woman who died when you were young. Tell me something true, something specific, a memory, a name, anything at all that doesn't sound like it was rehearsed for exactly this conversation." Sophie's face went carefully, terribly still, and in that stillness, the particular way she schooled her expression into blankness rather than panic, Gabriel felt the last of his doubt curdle into something far more dangerous than suspicion. He was, he realized with growing dread, looking at a woman who had spent her entire life learning exactly how to survive a moment like this one. "My mother's name was Carol," Sophie said, and even as the lie left her mouth, she felt Gabriel's eyes narrow fractionally, some invisible line between them drawn taut enough to snap. "I don't have many specific memories. I was very young when she died." "Carol was the woman who raised you," Gabriel said, voice deceptively soft, dangerous in the way still water was dangerous. "I'm asking about your mother, the one before her, the one whose name you've never once mentioned in 2 weeks of conversation, despite mentioning almost everything else about your life." The room seemed to narrow around her, the painted-over window suddenly suffocating. And Sophie understood, with the cold clarity of a woman who had trained her whole life for exactly this moment, and still felt unprepared for it, that the careful architecture of Sophie Bennett was cracking under the weight of a man who had decided finally to stop being gentle with his questions. "I don't know what you're asking me," she said, keeping her voice as steady as she could manage. "I've told you what I remember. If it's not enough for you, I'm sorry, but grief does strange things to memory. Some of it's just gone." "Interesting," Gabriel said, rising from his chair with unhurried, terrible calm, "that grief managed to erase not just memories, but entire paper trails, school records, medical histories, an entire childhood, scrubbed clean before the age of 11, replaced with a fabricated history so thorough it required real money and real connections to build." He crossed the room slowly, and Sophie made herself hold still, made herself not flinch, though every instinct screamed at her to run. "Tell me, Sophie, or whatever your name actually is, who builds a child a false past like that?" "In my experience, it's usually one of 2 kinds of people. Witness protection. or organised crime, protecting its own from retaliation. "You're scaring me," Sophie said, which was true, and which was also, in that moment, the only weapon she had left. The last honest thing she could offer to buy herself another hour, another day, another chance to figure out how to survive what was coming. Something in Gabriel's expression cracked, just slightly, the coldness giving way for one unguarded second to something that looked almost like pain. "I don't want to scare you," he said, quieter now. And for a moment the man who'd kissed her 3 nights ago, who'd brought her his dead mother's poetry, who'd told her things about his own grief he claimed to have never spoken aloud, that man surfaced again, warring visibly with the empire builder who could not, would not, let a mystery this large go unsolved. "I want the truth. That's all I've ever wanted from you. Give me that, and I promise you, whatever it is, we will find a way through it." "You won't," Sophie thought, grief rising thick in her throat, because she understood, better than he did in that moment, exactly what kind of truth she was carrying. "There is no version of your promise that survives my real name, Gabriel. You would kill me the second you understood what I am. You've built your entire life around exactly that vow." "There's nothing to find through," she said instead, forcing steel into her voice, even as her heart cracked audibly in her own chest. "I'm a bartender whose childhood was hard enough that the details got lost. That's the truth. If it's not satisfying enough for you, I'm sorry, but I can't manufacture a more interesting story just because you want one." Gabriel studied her for a long, unbearable moment, and Sophie watched him decide, visibly, to let it go. Not because he believed her, she understood with sick clarity, but because some part of him, the part that had brought her poetry and kissed her like a starving man, wasn't yet ready to face what he might find if he kept pulling the thread. "Not yet," he said quietly, as if answering a question she hadn't asked aloud. "But soon, Sophie. I will have the truth soon. I would rather hear it from you than from a file on my desk." He left without another word, and Sophie sat alone in the dim room, shaking, understanding that the countdown she'd been living under for 20 years had just accelerated into something measured, now not in years, but in days. She thought of Marcus, of the burner phone he'd mentioned bringing but never delivered, of the growing distance in his eyes the last time she'd seen him, as if he already knew something had shifted between her and his brother that changed the shape of everything. She needed to reach him. She needed a plan, and she had, she suspected, very little time left to build one. Dominic Falcone had spent 11 years watching the Rossi and Marchetti bloodlines destroy each other from a careful, profitable distance, and he had no intention of letting either family find peace now, not when war between them had made him rich beyond anything his own modest organisation could have earned honestly. He'd known about Sophie Bennett for nearly 3 years, had recognised her, in fact, before Marcus Rossi ever did, having kept a private file on the surviving Marchetti bloodline ever since a dying informant had whispered, in exchange for a painless death, that Salvatore's daughter had been hidden somewhere in Louisiana under a name that wasn't hers. Falcone had done nothing with the information for years, content to let it sit like a loaded gun in a drawer, useful only in the specific moment when using it would cause maximum damage. That moment, he now understood, watching from the shadows of an organisation far more sophisticated than either the Rossis or what remained of the Marchettis realised, had finally arrived. "Gabriel's been distracted," his associate reported, sliding into the booth of the dim riverside bar Falcone preferred for meetings too sensitive for phones. Word is, he's fallen for the bartender he's holding. Hasn't touched the docks business in weeks. Half his organisation thinks he's lost his edge. Falcone smiled, slow and satisfied, swirling the bourbon in his glass. Better than I hoped. Let him fall in love with her. Let him get soft and sentimental and forget, for just long enough, exactly whose blood runs in her veins. He took a slow sip, savouring the taste of a plan finally coming together after years of patient waiting. And Marcus? Still protecting her? Seems so. Hasn't told his brother anything, best we can tell. Good boy, Falcone murmured, almost fond, the way a man might speak of a chess piece performing exactly as designed. Loyal to a fault, that one. It'll make what comes next so much more devastating. He set down his glass, dark eyes gleaming with the particular pleasure of a man who had spent over a decade waiting for exactly this configuration of pieces to fall into place. Here is what I want. I want the truth delivered to Gabriel Rossi at the worst possible moment, not quietly, not through some intermediary he can control the fallout of, but publicly, dramatically, in front of enough witnesses that he cannot simply bury the information and move on with his sentimental little romance. I want him humiliated in front of his own organisation for having fallen in love with his father's killer's daughter. I want the Marchetti girl exposed so thoroughly that even if some part of Gabriel wants to forgive her, his own men will never let him. And if it starts a war between the Rossis and whatever's left of the Marchetti loyalists, then I inherit whatever's left standing, Falcone said simply, the way I always intended to. Two old, proud families, so consumed by blood and vengeance, they never once noticed the man quietly building an empire in the spaces between their war. He raised his glass in a private toast to no one. All I need now is the right moment, the right stage. Something Gabriel can't control, can't contain, can't quietly manage the way he's managed every other crisis in his organisation for 15 years. His father's memorial gala, the associate said slowly, understanding dawning. End of the month. Every major family in the region attends. Rossi allies, Rossi enemies, half the old guard who remember exactly what the Marchettis did 20 years ago. Falcone's smile widened, genuine now, the expression of a man who had just been handed the final piece of a puzzle he'd spent a decade assembling. Perfect, he said softly. Let the son fall in love with his father's murderer's daughter, and then let every person who ever mourned that murder watch the truth land in the middle of the very night meant to honour the dead man's memory. He drained his glass, already 3 steps ahead, already tasting the particular sweetness of chaos engineered rather than survived. Prepare the documentation. Birth records, old photographs, whatever proof exists that Sophie Bennett is Elena Marchetti reborn. I want it airtight, undeniable, impossible for Gabriel Rossi to dismiss or bury, however desperately he might want to by then. Somewhere across the city, in a penthouse overlooking the river, Gabriel Rossi sat with a glass of wine he wasn't drinking, turning over the growing certainty in his gut that the woman he'd fallen for was hiding something enormous, entirely unaware that the timeline for discovering that truth had just been taken out of his hands entirely. engineered instead by a man patient enough to wait a decade for the exact right night to burn two families to the ground. Gabriel made his decision 3 nights later, alone on the penthouse terrace, watching the river carry its cargo of barges and moonlight past the docks his family had bled for. He had spent those 3 nights turning Dante's file over in his mind, chasing the shape of the truth he suspected, and each time he arrived at the edge of certainty, he found himself pulling back. Not out of cowardice, he told himself, but because some deeper instinct insisted that the truth, whatever it was, would not change what he had already decided to feel. He found her on the terrace when he finally went looking, having been given by then enough freedom within the penthouse walls that a guard simply nodded him through instead of announcing her presence. She stood at the railing, with her arms wrapped around herself against the night air, hair loose, the city's lights catching gold in it, and Gabriel stopped a few feet away, simply looking at her for a long moment before he spoke. "I've decided something," he said. Sophie turned, wary, in the particular way she'd been wary since their last conversation in her room, the accusation still hanging unresolved between them. "About Falcone? About whatever it is you think you're going to find in my past? About you." He crossed the remaining distance, close enough now that the wind carried her scent to him, something warm, floral, achingly familiar after weeks of stolen evenings in that dim room. "I don't care anymore, Sophie. Whatever you're hiding, whatever ghost is buried under the name Sophie Bennett, I've decided it doesn't matter. I want you. Not the leverage I thought I was taking, not the mystery my organisation keeps digging for. You. Whoever you actually are underneath all of it." Her breath caught, visible in the cool air, and something in her expression cracked open. Hope, grief, terror, all tangled together in a way that made Gabriel's chest ache with a tenderness he'd spent 15 years training himself not to feel for anyone. "You don't mean that," she whispered. "You don't know what you're saying yes to." "I know exactly what I'm saying yes to." He reached up, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, his palm lingering against her jaw with a gentleness that felt, even to him, like a foreign language he was only just learning to speak. "I'm saying yes to a woman who reads a room before she reads a person, who redirected every question I asked for 2 weeks without ever once lying to me outright, who cried reading my mother's poetry and thought I didn't notice. I'm saying yes to whatever you are, Sophie, because I have spent 20 years building a life around a vow to my dead father, and for the first time since I made that vow, I've found something I want more than the revenge I promised him." "Gabriel." Her voice broke on his name, and he felt her hand come up to rest against his chest, right over the place where his heart had gone unsteady and reckless for the first time in longer than he could remember. "If you knew the truth about me, you would not be standing here saying this." "Then tell me," he said quietly, and this time there was no interrogation in it, no forensic edge, only a plea, raw and unguarded, from a man who had decided, finally, that love mattered more than the vow that had organised his entire adult life. "Tell me, and let me prove to you that it doesn't change what I just said. Let me prove that I meant it." She looked at him for a long, aching moment, and Gabriel watched something war behind her eyes, courage rising, fear crushing it back down, courage rising again, and for one suspended heartbeat, he thought she might actually say it, might actually hand him the truth he'd been chasing for weeks, the truth that would either break them both or somehow, impossibly, let them survive it together. "My real name," she started, voice trembling, "is—" The terrace doors slid open behind them, and Dante stepped through, face tight with the particular urgency of a man bringing news that couldn't wait. "Boss, you need to see this. Falcone's people have been moving documentation through 3 different channels tonight. Financial records, old case files, something big. I don't know what it is yet, but it's heading somewhere specific, and my gut says it's not good." Gabriel's jaw tightened, torn between the urgency of his lieutenant's warning and the impossible weight of the confession trembling on Sophie's lips. And in the end, the instincts of 15 years running an empire won out over the newer, more fragile instincts of a man falling in love. "I'll be right there," he said, and turned back to Sophie, cupping her face in both hands. "Tell me tomorrow. Whatever it is, tell me tomorrow, when we have time to sit with it properly. And I promise you, Sophie, whatever you are, I have already decided. I choose you." He kissed her once, softly, a promise rather than hunger, and left her standing alone on the terrace, with the truth still locked behind her teeth, and the terrible, ticking knowledge that tomorrow might already be too late. Marcus found Sophie on the terrace 20 minutes after Gabriel left, drawn there by some instinct he couldn't fully name, and found her still shaking, one hand pressed to her mouth as if to hold in words that had almost escaped. "He knows," she said before Marcus could ask. "Not everything, but he knows there's something, and he's decided he doesn't care, and I almost told him, Marcus. I almost said it out loud." Marcus felt the floor tilt beneath him. 3 years of careful protection suddenly balanced on a single, unspoken sentence. "Sophie, he said he chooses me." Her voice cracked, raw with an emotion Marcus recognized instantly and painfully, because he had felt an echo of it himself for 3 long years, watching her from the careful distance he'd imposed on his own heart. "He said it doesn't matter what I'm hiding. And some part of me believed him, Marcus. Some part of me wanted so badly to just tell him and see if it was actually true." "It's not," Marcus said, quiet and certain, the words costing him more than she could know. "I love my brother. I would die for him. But I have known him his whole life, and I am telling you, Sophie, the vow he made over our father's body is not something love erases. It's something love has to survive alongside. And I don't believe, not for 1 second, that Gabriel Rossi is capable of looking at Salvatore Marchetti's daughter and seeing anything but the debt he's spent 20 years trying to collect." Sophie's eyes filled, and she looked away from him, toward the river, toward the lights of a city that had no idea 2 entire families balanced on the edge of a single secret. "Then what do I do? He's going to keep pushing. Dante's already found the gaps in my records. It's only a matter of time before someone puts the pieces together properly, and I would rather he hear it from me than from a file on Falcone's desk." "You don't tell him," Marcus said, and the decision he'd been circling for days finally crystallized into words. "You leave. Tonight, if you have to. I've been building an exit for you since the night I realized what was happening between you and my brother. New papers, a route out of the city, Enough money to disappear somewhere he'll never think to look. I should have offered it to you the moment they brought you here, but I kept hoping there was another way, some version of this where you got to stay and still stay safe. There isn't. There never was. And what happens to you, Sophie asked quietly, when Gabriel realizes you helped me disappear? Marcus's jaw tightened, the same old ache rising in his chest, 3 years of unspoken love finally arriving at its inevitable cost. I lose my brother's trust, maybe worse, but I've had 3 years to prepare myself for that particular loss, Sophie, and I would rather live with Gabriel's anger than live with the certainty that I let him kill you because I was too afraid to act. I can't ask you to do that. You're not asking, Marcus said. I'm offering. There's a difference, and I need you to understand it because I have loved you quietly for 3 years, Sophie, in every way I was allowed to, and several ways I wasn't supposed to, and the only thing that's ever mattered more to me than that love is the fact that you deserve to survive it. Even if surviving means you walk out of my life completely and I never see you again. Sophie stepped forward and took his hand, holding it the way she had in that first terrible week of captivity, and something in Marcus's chest both broke and steadied at once. Grief and relief tangled together in the particular way that only came from loving someone you'd already accepted you would never fully have. "Give me tonight," she said finally. "Let me think. If Gabriel comes to me tomorrow the way he said he would, I want to see his face when I tell him. I want to know, once and for all, whether what he said on that terrace was real or whether it was the kind of thing men say before the truth arrives and changes everything." She squeezed his hand. "If I'm wrong, if his face tells me what you already believe it will, I'll be ready to run. I promise you that." Marcus nodded, throat too tight for words, and left her on the terrace with the city glittering below, understanding, with the particular grief of a man who had just offered everything he had, and watched it be gently, kindly, inevitably declined. That he had done what love actually required of him, not claiming her, but protecting her, even from the brother he loved, even at the cost of everything that came after. He didn't yet know that the choice would be taken out of everyone's hands within 24 hours, or that Falcone's documentation, already moving through its careful channels toward Gabriel's father's memorial gala, had rendered every quiet plan of protection and confession entirely, tragically irrelevant. The Rossi Memorial Gala had been held every year for 20 years, on the anniversary of Antonio Rossi's death, a tradition Gabriel had inherited along with the empire, and this year, walking into the ballroom on the arm of a woman he had decided, against every rule he'd ever lived by, to claim publicly for the first time, he felt something he hadn't felt at this particular event in 2 decades. Hope. Sophie wore emerald green, a dress Gabriel had chosen himself and had delivered to her that afternoon, with a note that simply read, "Wear this and stand beside me tonight, whatever comes." And she had dressed with hands that trembled only slightly, some fragile, dangerous optimism warring with the dread Marcus's warning had planted in her the night before. She had not run, she had told herself, dressing in the low evening light, that she owed Gabriel the chance to prove Marcus wrong, owed herself the chance to find out if the man on that terrace had meant what he said, before she disappeared into whatever life Marcus's careful planning had built for her. The ballroom glittered with old money and older grudges, chandeliers throwing gold light across faces Sophie recognized only from the careful education Aunt Carol had given her years ago. The Castellanos, stiff and watchful. The Delacroix family, keeping carefully to the far side of the room. A dozen other names that had once meant danger to a 5-year-old girl fleeing in the night. Now simply strangers in expensive suits, drinking champagne beneath portraits of a man Gabriel's family still mourned. "You look terrified," Gabriel murmured, close to her ear as they moved through the crowd, his hand warm and possessive at the small of her back. "I've never been to anything like this," she said, which was true, though not for the reasons he assumed. "You're safe with me." He said it with such quiet, absolute certainty that something in her chest ached with the impossible wish that it could be true, regardless of what waited to be discovered. Whatever happens tonight, whatever anyone says to you or about you, you are under my protection now, publicly, completely. I want every person in this room to understand that. She wanted, more than she'd wanted anything in 20 years, to believe him. She was still turning that wish over, watching him greet an old business associate with the easy, controlled charm of a man born to this world, when she felt eyes on her from across the room, and turned to find a man she didn't recognize, watching her with an expression of pure, satisfied malice. A man in an impeccable grey suit, holding a glass of bourbon, smiling at her like a predator who had finally cornered his prey after a very long hunt. Dominic Falcone. He raised his glass to her, slow and deliberate, and Sophie felt ice slide down her spine, some ancient animal instinct recognizing danger before her conscious mind caught up to the shape of it. "Gabriel," she said quietly, tugging at his sleeve, "that man. Who is that man?" Gabriel followed her gaze, and his expression hardened instantly. "Falcone. He shouldn't be here. This event is invitation only, and he was never on the list." His hand found hers, protective, tightening. "Stay close to me." But Falcone was already moving through the crowd toward the small, raised platform where the evening's remembrance speeches would be given, moving with the unhurried confidence of a man who had waited over a decade for exactly this moment. And Sophie watched with dawning, paralyzing horror as he climbed the 2 steps to the microphone that had been set up for Gabriel's annual tribute to his father, and tapped it, once, twice, the sound cracking through the ballroom's low murmur of conversation. "Forgive the interruption," Falcone said, his voice carrying easily through the sudden hush that fell across the room, champagne glasses freezing halfway to lips, 300 pairs of eyes turning toward the small, immaculate man who had just hijacked the most sacred night of the Rossi family calendar. "But I think, before Gabriel gives his tribute to his father tonight, there's something the room deserves to know. Something about the beautiful woman standing at his side." Sophie felt Gabriel's hand tighten around hers, felt the whole trajectory of her carefully constructed life narrow down to this single, unbearable moment, and understood, with the particular clarity of a woman who had spent 20 years running from exactly this outcome, that the countdown had finally, irrevocably, run out. "Her name," Falcone said, voice ringing clear and merciless across 300 stunned faces, "is not Sophie Bennett. I imagine most of you have never heard the name she was actually born with, because a great deal of money and a great deal of fear went into making sure of that. But I have documents, birth records, a photograph taken at a charity gala 23 years ago, testimony from a woman who helped raise her under a false identity for 2 decades, that prove, beyond any reasonable doubt, that the woman on Gabriel Rossi's arm tonight is Elena Marchetti, daughter of Salvatore Marchetti, the man whose organization murdered Antonio Rossi 20 years ago, on the very anniversary this room has gathered tonight to mourn. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Sophie had ever heard in her life. She felt Gabriel's hand go rigid around hers, felt the exact moment understanding crashed through him, not slowly, not with the mercy of gradual realization, but all at once, total and catastrophic. His whole body going still beside her, the way a man's body goes still right before violence. She turned to look at him and found his face utterly transformed. The warmth of the terrace 3 nights ago wiped away entirely, replaced by something cold and stricken and furious all at once. And she understood, in that single frozen look, that Marcus had been right, that whatever love had grown between them on the terrace had just collided head-on with 20 years of vengeance, and vengeance, in this moment, was winning. "Gabriel?" Her voice came out small, breaking. "Gabriel, please, let me explain." "Is it true?" His voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried, in the terrible silence of that ballroom, to every straining ear in the room. "Salvatore Marchetti. Is he your father?" She could have lied. Even then, even with Falcone's documentation surely already being passed hand to hand through the crowd, she could have tried one more desperate deflection, bought herself one more hour. But looking at Gabriel's face, the devastation underneath the fury, the particular betrayal of a man who had just offered her everything and discovered in the same breath that the offer had been built on a foundation of the one lie he could never forgive, Sophie found she had no strength left for anything but the truth. "Yes," she said, and the word landed in the ballroom like a gunshot. "Salvatore Marchetti was my father. I was 5 years old when your family killed him. My mother hid me, changed my name, erased every record of who I was, because she knew that if the Rossi family ever found me, they would finish what the war started." Her voice shook, but she made herself keep going, made herself say it all now that the worst of it was already out. "I never sought you out, Gabriel. I never plotted revenge. I poured drinks in a bar for 3 years and tried to disappear into an ordinary life. And your men took me off the street, believing I was someone else's pawn. Everything that happened between us since then, every conversation, every night in that room, everything on the terrace 3 nights ago, none of it was a lie. I fell in love with you, despite 20 years of being taught that your family was the reason mine burned to the ground." Gabriel's hand released hers, as if her skin had turned to fire, and he stepped back, putting distance between them in front of 300 witnesses, his face a mask of controlled devastation that made Sophie's chest cave in with grief. "You let me bring you my mother's poetry," he said, voice hollow. "You let me kiss you. You let me stand here tonight and claim you in front of my father's memory, knowing the entire time that you were his killer's daughter. I was afraid, Sophie said, tears finally breaking free, sliding hot down her face in front of the entire assembled underworld of New Orleans. I was afraid you would kill me the moment you knew. And I was right to be afraid, wasn't I? Look at your face, Gabriel. Look at what 20 years of vengeance has already decided before you've even had a full minute to think. Around them, the ballroom had begun to stir. Murmurs rising, old Rossi allies exchanging glances heavy with decades of grief and grievance. Several men Sophie didn't recognise, already moving discreetly toward the exits, hands drifting toward jackets that concealed weapons this event had always, quietly, assumed it wouldn't need. She saw Marcus pushing through the crowd toward them, face white with horror. And she saw Falcone still standing on the small platform, watching the chaos he'd engineered unfold with the serene satisfaction of a man who had finally collected on a decade-long investment. And she saw Gabriel Rossi, the man who had chosen her 3 nights ago on a moonlit terrace. The man whose hand had been warm and possessive at her back not 15 minutes earlier, reach slowly, deliberately into his jacket, his dark eyes never leaving her face, and understood with the particular grief of a woman watching her worst fear finally arrive, exactly what came next. Gabriel's hand closed around the pistol in his jacket, and for one endless, terrible second, Sophie waited for the shot that would end 20 years of hiding in the most public possible way, waited for the particular mercy of death arriving quickly rather than the slow terror she'd lived with her whole life. But instead of raising the weapon toward her, Gabriel turned in one fluid, violent motion and levelled it at Dominic Falcone. "You engineered this," Gabriel said, voice gone low and lethal, the ballroom around them scattering into screams and shoving bodies as 300 guests realised, belatedly, exactly what kind of party they'd wandered into. "You've been circling her for weeks. You knew who she was before I did, and you waited. You actually waited for the exact night that would do the most damage, the night meant to honour my father's memory, to detonate this in front of every family that matters in this city." "I merely delivered the truth," Falcone said, unbothered, though Sophie noted the slight step backward, the flicker of calculation behind his composed expression as he registered the very real gun pointed at his chest. "What you do with it, Gabriel, is entirely your own business. I only thought the room deserved to know exactly whose blood was standing beside you tonight." "You thought a war would make you rich," Gabriel said. "You've spent a decade waiting for the Rossis and the Marchettis to finish killing each other so you could pick through what's left." "I've known men like you my entire life, Dominic. You mistake patience for cleverness." Marcus reached them then, breathless, placing himself bodily between his brother and the crowd of increasingly agitated guests, several of whom had drawn weapons of their own in response to the chaos, old Rossi allies and rival families alike, bracing for the bloodshed the room's history suggested was inevitable. "Gabriel," he said, low and urgent, "not here, not in front of everyone. Whatever you're feeling right now, whatever you decide about Sophie, don't let Falcone get exactly what he came for tonight." Something in Gabriel's rigid posture wavered, the calculation of a man who had built an empire on control, warring visibly with 20 years of grief, finally given a face to focus on. Sophie watched him, heart hammering, and understood that the next 30 seconds would determine not just her fate, but the fate of everyone in that glittering, terrified ballroom. "Take him," Gabriel said, finally, gesturing to two of his men, who moved to flank Falcone with the swift, silent efficiency of soldiers who had trained for exactly this kind of crisis. "Not here. Somewhere private, where we can discuss, at length, exactly how much he's known and for how long, and what he intended to gain from tonight's little performance." His eyes finally, terribly, found Sophie's again. "As for you—" "Gabriel, please!" Marcus's voice cracked with a desperation Sophie had never heard from him before. 3 years of careful composure abandoned entirely in the face of what was about to happen. "I knew. I've known for 3 years who she really is, and I never told you. Because I believed, I still believe, that she is not responsible for what your family and hers did to each other before either of us was old enough to understand any of it. If you're going to be angry with someone tonight, be angry with me. I'm the one who kept the secret. She only ever tried to survive it." Gabriel's gaze snapped to his brother, something raw and betrayed moving across his face at this second revelation, layered on top of the first. And for a moment, Sophie thought the fury might redirect entirely, might consume the fragile bond between the two brothers, instead of whatever remained between herself and Gabriel. 3 years, Gabriel said, voice shaking now, with an emotion too complicated to name. Grief, betrayal, something almost like heartbreak layered beneath the fury. "You've known for 3 years, and you let me bring her into my home, into my bed, into my father's memorial, without a single word." "I let you fall in love with her," Marcus corrected quietly, "because I believed, watching the two of you these past weeks, that whatever grew between you was more real than the war our fathers left us. I was protecting her, Gabriel, and in the end, without meaning to, I think I was protecting you too, from becoming a man who kills the woman he loves because of a debt neither of you chose to inherit." The ballroom had emptied significantly by then, guests fleeing toward exits under the watchful, tense presence of Rossi security, and in the sudden relative quiet of the half-empty room, Gabriel stood between his brother and the woman he'd claimed publicly not 20 minutes earlier. Gun still loose in his hand, chest heaving with the particular exhaustion of a man whose entire understood world had just been rewritten in the space of a single conversation. "I need to think," he said finally, voice hollow, and turned away from both of them, walking toward the tall windows overlooking the river, leaving Sophie standing alone in her emerald dress, with tears drying cold on her face, understanding that the verdict she'd feared for 20 years had not yet been delivered, but that the waiting, somehow, felt almost as unbearable as any outcome could. They gave him an hour, the longest hour of Sophie's life, standing in a private study off the ballroom, while Gabriel remained alone by the windows, staring out at a river that had witnessed 20 years of blood between their families and offered no answers now, either. Marcus stayed close to her, silent, guilt and love both etched plainly across his face. And Sophie found herself, in that terrible waiting hour, grateful for his presence, in a way that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with the particular comfort of not facing the end alone. When Gabriel finally returned, his face had changed, not softened exactly, but settled into something Sophie couldn't immediately read, the careful stillness of a man who had made a decision and intended to see it through, regardless of what it cost him. 20 years ago, he said without preamble, I knelt on a hospital floor and promised my dying father I would make every Marchetti understand what his death cost. I have spent my entire adult life organizing my choices around that promise. I have killed men in service of it. I have built an empire on the foundation of it. And 3 weeks ago, I brought a woman into my home, believing she was leverage against an enemy. And instead, I fell in love with her so completely that when my own lieutenant handed me proof that something didn't add up in her past, I chose, for the first time in my life, to look away from a truth rather than pursue it, because some part of me already suspected what I would find, and I was not ready to lose what I'd found in her. Gabriel, Sophie started, but he held up a hand, and she fell silent, some instinct telling her this was a speech he needed to finish without interruption. I have spent the last hour, he continued, voice rough, asking myself an honest question. Not whether I can forgive the daughter of the man whose organization killed my father. That forgiveness, I think, is a separate and complicated thing I may spend years working through. The question I actually needed to answer was simpler. Do I love the woman standing in front of me? Not the ghost of a war 20 years dead. Not the abstraction of a Marchetti bloodline I was taught to hate before I could read. Her. Sophie. Elena. Whatever name she wears. His eyes finally found hers, dark and exhausted, and beneath it all, unmistakably tender. And the answer, God help me, hasn't changed since I said it to you on that terrace 3 nights ago. Sophie's breath caught, hope rising dangerously in her chest, even as she braced for a conditional she was certain must follow. But I cannot simply decide that the war is over because I've fallen in love, Gabriel went on. There are men in my organization who will demand blood for what happened tonight. Not because you did anything, but because the old grudges run deeper than my personal feelings. And the boss who is seen to forgive an enemy's blood without consequence is a boss who invites his own organization to question his judgment on everything else. I need time, Sophie. I need to manage what happens next carefully, or this ends not in a wedding, but in a funeral, possibly several. What do you need from me? Sophie asked, voice barely steady. Trust, Gabriel said. The same trust I'm asking myself to extend to you, despite everything. Stay. Let me handle Falcone. Let me handle my own men. Let me find a way through this that doesn't end with either of us dead by morning. I know I have no right to ask that of you, given what tonight revealed about how much I still don't understand about your life. But I am asking anyway, because the alternative is losing you, and I find, having finally admitted what I feel, that I am no longer willing to accept that outcome. Sophie crossed the room and took his hands, feeling them tremble slightly beneath her fingers, the first tremor she'd ever felt from a man who had built his entire reputation on absolute control. I've spent 20 years running, she said. I am tired of running, Gabriel. If you're asking me to stay and fight for this instead, I'm telling you, I already decided that answer on the terrace before Falcone ever opened his mouth tonight. I choose this. I choose you, whatever it costs either of us. Behind them, Marcus watched the two of them clasp hands with an expression of complicated grief and something that, after a long moment, settled into genuine relief. The particular peace of a man who had protected the people he loved as best he could, and was finally, after 3 exhausting years, allowed to simply hope for their happiness rather than orchestrate it from the shadows. 3 months later, the docks still belonged to the Rossi family, though the shape of the empire had shifted in ways 20 years of pure vengeance had never allowed. Falcone was gone, not dead, though several of Gabriel's men had argued fiercely for that outcome, but exiled entirely from the region's underworld, his organization dismantled piece by piece over 11 quiet, ruthlessly efficient weeks, his decade of patient scheming undone in less time than it had taken him to build it. Gabriel had wanted him dead. Sophie, in the end, had asked for something else. Not mercy exactly, but a different kind of justice, one that didn't require more blood spilled in the name of old wars neither of them wanted to keep fighting. "You're sentimental," Gabriel had told her, the night they'd made the decision together, standing on the same terrace where he'd first told her he chose her. For a woman who spent 20 years surviving a war she never started. "Maybe that's exactly why," Sophie had said. "I know better than anyone what it costs to build a life out of someone else's vengeance. I don't want that for us. I don't want our children, if we ever have any, growing up the way I did. Hidden, afraid, carrying a debt they never agreed to owe." It had taken time, after that terrible night in the ballroom, for the old guard within Gabriel's organization to accept what their boss had decided, that the daughter of Salvatore Marchetti would remain not as a hostage or a bargaining chip, but as the woman standing openly at Gabriel Rossi's side, claimed publicly and completely, blood debt notwithstanding. There had been dissent. There had been, in the first difficult weeks, at least one attempt by an old lieutenant loyal to the original vow to take matters into his own hands, an attempt Gabriel had ended swiftly and without hesitation, making unmistakably clear to every remaining member of his organization that Sophie's safety was no longer negotiable, regardless of what blood ran in her veins. Marcus had stayed close through all of it, the guilt of 3 years of silence slowly, painfully transmuting into something more peaceful. Not quite friendship with his brother, restored to its old, easy shape, but something workmanlike and honest, built on the particular understanding that comes after two people survive nearly losing everything together. He had, in the months since, started seeing someone new, a woman he'd met through the restaurant business rather than the family one, someone entirely unconnected to the old wars. And Sophie liked to think, watching him laugh at something across a dinner table one warm evening in early autumn, that some part of him had finally allowed himself the ordinary happiness he'd denied himself for 3 long years of quiet, unspoken devotion. "Do you ever regret it?" Gabriel asked her one night, months later, the two of them tangled together on the same terrace, the city's lights spread out below like scattered stars fallen to earth. "Telling the truth, losing the life you built as Sophie Bennett." "I regret that it took a man like Falcone to force the truth out, instead of me choosing to give it freely," she admitted, resting her head against his chest, listening to the steady, familiar rhythm of his heart. "But I don't regret the truth itself. I spent 20 years being someone I wasn't, Gabriel, because the alternative felt like death. I'm tired of choosing survival over living. I'd rather be Elena, fully, dangerously, completely, even if that means being Elena Marchetti standing beside Gabriel Rossi, which 20 years ago would have gotten us both killed on sight." "It still might have, if you'd told a different man." His arms tightened around her, the particular possessiveness she'd once found terrifying, now simply, comfortingly familiar. The mark of a man who had learned, slowly and against every instinct his upbringing had given him, how to love without demanding ownership of everything he touched.
I keep thinking about that hospital corridor, kneeling beside my father, promising him a war that would never end. I wonder sometimes what he'd think of this, of me, loving his enemy's daughter, choosing her over the vow I made with his blood still warm on my hands. What do you think he'd say? Gabriel was quiet for a long moment, watching the river carry its slow cargo past the docks that had cost both their families so much.
"I think," he said finally, "that he'd understand, in the end, that the war was never really about Marchettis or Rossis. It was about two men who loved their families enough to destroy themselves trying to protect them. And I think, if he could see us now, he might recognize that protecting the people you love sometimes means choosing peace instead of vengeance, even when peace costs you everything you thought you were fighting for." Sophie tilted her face up to his, and Gabriel kissed her slowly, deliberately, the way he'd learned to do everything since that first reckless night, not with the desperate hunger of a man seizing something before it could be taken from him, but with the quiet, steady certainty of a man who had finally, after 20 years of vengeance, found something worth building instead of destroying. Below them, the docks glittered under the New Orleans night, indifferent to the 2 decades of blood that had shaped the empire surrounding them. And somewhere across the city, in a bar that no longer belonged to a woman named Sophie Bennett, new bartenders poured drinks for strangers who had no idea that a fugitive daughter of a murdered Mafia king had once stood behind that same counter, learning to survive a life that wasn't hers, before finally, at devastating cost, choosing to live the one that was.